Have you ever carried a label for so long that it stopped sounding like an accusation and started sounding like your own voice? Maybe nobody officially gave it to you. Maybe nobody sat you down and said the exact words. But somewhere along the way, through comments, assumptions, or comparisons, maybe it was a disappointment, or it's just your own insecurity, you started wearing it. For me, one of those labels has been not legitimate. The strange thing about labels is that at first, they almost feel like they're coming from somewhere else, like they're coming from a person or a system. Maybe it was a comment or a misunderstanding. But when we carry them long enough, eventually they stop sounding like they're coming from somewhere else. They start sounding like they're us and they're coming from us. They sound like honesty. Maybe it sounds something like, look, I'm just being realistic with myself. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Because sometimes the most damaging labels are not the ones that are shouted at us, they're the ones that we quietly accept. And then we repeat them in our own voice in our heads. Welcome back to From Hollow to Holy. I'm your host, Justin, and this is Shadows, a series where I'm reflecting on the patterns, distractions, fears, and the tactics that quietly pull us away from the peace, truth, purpose, and ultimately from God. As I've studied some of the tactics that Satan uses, I look at the patterns you find in Scripture. And while I'm studying them, I've noticed some unexpected things happening. What I thought I was studying were tactics that were around me that we see in the world today. But as I studied, I started recognizing those same tactics just within me. And I started noticing there are voices in my own head that I have accepted as truth, voices that I had stopped questioning. And one of the main voices that kept saying, "You're not legitimate. You're not legitimate in your career. You're not legitimate in your struggles. Heck, you're not legitimate in your life or your progress. No, even worse, you're not enough." And, once I saw it, I started seeing how that label had followed me into different parts of my life. Like different rooms, different situations, same label, just a different costume. I think one of the tactics that Satan uses is labeling. Not always obvious labeling. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's simply subtle. It comes through maybe comparison or through public perception or expectations, maybe some shame. Sometimes it's just how we interpret other people's reactions. And other times it's just through our own insecurities. The label will often get introduced, and then Satan just takes the back seat and waits. Because if we repeat it long enough, he doesn't have to keep saying it in our ear. We start saying it to ourselves. That's when the label really becomes dangerous because now it doesn't even sound like temptation. It just sounds like our own thoughts. It sounds like, well, this is just who I am. This is just my reality. This is just me being honest. Think about it. How many people, including yourself, have you heard say that to someone? Or maybe you say it to yourself. This is just who I am. I can't change it. This is just my reality. I can't do anything about it. This is just me being honest with you or with myself. You know, but one of those questions that I've learned to start asking is, who told me that? Who told me I wasn't legitimate? Who told me I wasn't enough? Who told me my progress didn't count or that my struggle wasn't real? And maybe the deeper question overall is, does God speak to me that way? Because if he doesn't, maybe that voice deserves to be questioned. One of the places this label showed up for me was in pharmacy. I have worked as a pharmacy technician for years. And I do want to preface and be careful here because this isn't about tearing down the profession or any singling out of the profession. Pharmacists and pharmacy technicians, we they both have important roles. Pharmacists carry clinical responsibilities and liabilities that technicians simply don't, and that matters. On the other hand, pharmacy technicians also carry a lot of the day to day workflow that a lot of patients and many people never notice. You know, they handle insurance issues, prior authorizations, billing problems, inventory. Maybe it's a refill or payment questions, or it's a phone call, or just the overall workflow. And often, when patients come to the counter frustrated or confused, the pharmacy technician is the first person trying to help them figure out what's actually happening. But public perception doesn't always understand that. And early on in my career, especially working in a bigger retail setting, I started feeling that way. I felt like patients often assumed that because I was just a pharmacy tech, I didn't know what I was doing. I couldn't really help or understand the problem because I haven't had that same training. And really, it came down to they thought the real answer has to come from the pharmacist, regardless of the question. I'll believe it when the pharmacist says it. That's appropriate in some circumstances. That is part of the profession. But there are also many situations where a technician actually knew exactly how to help the issue that was right in front of us. And somewhere in all of that, a label started to form. At first, maybe it was just frustration. Maybe it was a combination of frustration, then defensiveness, then this quiet internal feeling of, I'm just a tech, that started being placed. And that word, just, it's powerful because I'm a pharmacy technician is a role, while I'm just a pharmacy technician is a label. That one word, just, changes the entire meaning. It takes something valuable and makes it sound small. It takes responsibility and it makes it sound less. It takes experience and makes it sound like a consolation prize. And I really feel that label was connected with something that was already inside me. Because I also felt like people assumed that I eventually move forward and become a pharmacist. Like a pharmacy technician simply wasn't a destination. It was just maybe a stepping stone. And because I didn't move forward in pharmacy school, because I didn't pursue that precious PharmD, I think part of me started questioning myself. Did I take the easy way out? Was I just afraid to try? Or did I not have enough confidence? Maybe it was I stopped short. Or overall, did I settle? Was I less legitimate somehow because I didn't become a pharmacist? That label started following me. Even later, when I became the program director and lecturer where I am currently for the pharmacy tech program here in Price, the label didn't automatically disappear. A new title didn't instantly heal that old voice like I thought it would. And that surprised me because part of me thought the title would settle that internal monologue. Now I teach, right? Now I lead a program while I'm building curriculum and I'm helping students prepare not only for the field, but for their future. I'm showing them what the possibilities are. I am now legitimate. But achievement doesn't automatically remove the labels we've internalized. Sometimes we reach the things we thought would prove the label wrong, and then we realize the label was never really about the title. It was about the voice we had accepted inside ourselves. And for me, that voice was saying, you're not legitimate. And this label didn't only show up in my career, it showed up in my health. I was diagnosed with CLL back in 2021, which CLL stands for chronic lymphocytic leukemia. In simple terms, it's a form of leukemia that affects certain white blood cells, and for some people, it can simply be monitored by doctors over time. But the reason I bring it up isn't to turn this into some medical episode. I bring it up because it became another place where labels started showing up. Because I don't look sick all the time. I work, I mountain bike, I stay active, I try to go to the gym, I keep going. And sometimes it does feel like people don't know how to place it, right? When people hear the word leukemia, what do you picture? Right? They often picture someone who looks extremely sick, someone that, you know, doesn't seem as healthy as the normal people. Because when you look at healthy, maybe people assume that you're healthy, right? And I'm not saying people are trying to be cruel by assuming that I am making something up, but I'm am saying that it's inside that causes it, right? A lot of this may be just be in my own mind and how I interpret reactions. I'm not saying anyone's judging, but the feeling is still real. Whether anyone meant to communicate it or not, the label I sometimes heard was, your struggle isn't legitimate because I can't see it. And maybe you've felt that too. Not necessarily because you have CLL or some chronic illness, but struggles are real. Maybe your struggle's anxiety. Maybe it's depression. Maybe it's grief or chronic pain or exhaustion. You're something invisible, something you carry quietly. Financial pressure, spiritual wrestling, or you're just simply exhausted. Looking okay and being okay are not always the same thing. What people cannot see can still be very real. And honestly, this label shows up in other areas too. It shows up when I think where I thought my family would be by now. Our living conditions or our home ownership situation, our finances, the version of life I thought I might be at this stage. It shows up in my fitness. I push, I train, I ride, I try to improve. And sometimes the progress feels painfully slow. And then when you jump on social media and it shows these quick transformations or these six-pack ab shortcuts, dad bod fixes, extreme before and after claims, honestly, I flipping hate clickbait because real life does not usually work that way. Real bodies do not work that way. Real progress doesn't work that quick. But when all you see is a quick transformation, your slower progress can start to feel fake. Like it doesn't count. Like it's not legitimate. Different room, different situation, same voice. Your career doesn't count. Your struggle doesn't count. Your progress doesn't count. Your life isn't far enough along. You're not legitimate yet. And that's why this tactic matters. Because a label can follow you into different rooms and make every blessing feel incomplete. What I'm starting to realize is that some of these labels may have started outside of me, but eventually they became my own voice. And that's the part I've only recently started to see. And as I've studied the tactics that Satan uses on us, and as I've tried to apply those tactics to today's world, I did start to notice something. I wasn't only studying what Satan does to other people, I was studying the patterns that have been active within myself. I started seeing how a voice had formed in my head and in my life that kept saying, not legitimate. And I think once I became aware of it, I really started putting that puzzle together. I started noticing how it interacted with my work, my health, my family, my goals, my faith, and my overall self image. That doesn't mean I suddenly fixed it, because I didn't. I'm still learning. I'm still becoming aware, and I'm still trying to notice when the voice really shows up. But awareness matters. Because once you can recognize the label, you can start questioning that label. You can ask, where did this come from? Is this really actually true? Is this how God would speak to me? Is this helping me become more like Christ, or is it keeping me trapped in a cycle of shame? And maybe the most important question is still, who told me that? This is why when I read scripture, I focus on the book of Moses. In Moses 1, it has become such a powerful example. At the beginning of Moses 1, God speaks to Moses. And more than once, God calls him Moses, my son. That's the identity God gives Moses. Before Moses talks to Satan, before any confrontation, before the temptation, before the confusion, God establishes identity with him. My son. Then, later, Satan comes to Moses, and Satan says, Moses, son of man, worship me. And that phrase is interesting to me because son of man isn't completely false, right? Let's look. Moses was mortal, he was human, he was limited, and he wasn't God. But the label was incomplete. It reduced him. It left out the most important truth that God had already revealed. God called him my son. Satan called him son of man. And I think that's how some labels work, right? They may contain a piece of truth, but they are way too small to define us. I am a pharmacy technician. That's true. But just a pharmacy tech is too small. I have CLL. That's a part of my life. But it's too small to define my worth. I have fitness goals. I have things in my life that are not where I thought they would be. That may be true. But not behind or not progressing or not disciplined enough is still too small to define the effort. I screw up a lot. I made mistakes. That's all true. But calling myself a failure is way too small. Some labels are dangerous not because they are entirely false, but because they're completely incomplete. They reduce us to one part of the story, one weakness, one role, one diagnosis, one disappointment, one unfinished goal, or one season. God does not define his children by one unfinished part of their story. And Moses could resist Satan because he remembered what God had called him first. That matters. So maybe one of the most important things we can do when a label comes back is remember what God called us first. I think about how God speaks to me. The feeling I recognize most is my son. And I don't say that because it's just an easy answer or because it's the answer I was taught to give. I say it because I feel it. I feel like the love I have for my own sons and my daughters, that kind of love is really hard to explain. It's deep. It's steady. It reaches somewhere in the soul that words do not always touch. And when I imagine God addressing the labels that I carry, I just can't imagine him saying, hurry up and prove yourself. Or you should be further by now. Or you're not legitimate or not valuable. Unless your title, your income, your health, or your circumstances look this way or that way. The voice I feel from God is different. It's steady, reassuring, it gives courage. And even when I screw up, which I do often, when I fall short, or when I know I could have done better, that voice feels the same and it still feels like, try again, keep going. And when I imagine God addressing the label not legitimate, I think he would say something like, I'm your father. Before every other label, remember this one. You are my son. That doesn't mean I stop improving. And it doesn't mean I stop repenting or stop working or growing or building or becoming. But it does mean I do not have to earn my identity through improvement. I do not improve so I can become his son. I improve because I am his son. That changes everything. Growth rooted in shame will always feel heavy, while growth rooted in a divine identity feels different. It still requires effort, it requires discipline, and it'll still ask us to change, but it does not begin with, "You are worthless unless you fix this." It begins with, "You are mine. Now keep going, keep becoming." So, the question this episode leaves us with is simple. What label have you been carrying that God never gave you? Could it be not enough or too far gone? Maybe it's unqualified or too weak, unlovable, not spiritual, not successful. Maybe you don't feel like your struggle's real. Or maybe it's like me and it's not legitimate, or you're not legitimate. Maybe nobody said it directly to you. Maybe you just pieced it together through comments or silence, comparison. Maybe it was a disappointment, or maybe social media, or maybe it was a fear or failure. Whatever experience or expectation, wherever it came from, it's worth asking, who told you that? Who told me that? Does God call us that? Because if the label consistently drives you to shame, fear, resentment, comparison, or despair, it's probably not the voice of God. If it reduces you to your worst moment, your weakest area, your unfinished goal, your title, or your public perception, maybe it's not the voice of God, right? If the label makes you feel like you have to become worthy of being loved, maybe it's not the voice of God. Because God's voice may invite us to repent. It may invite us to grow, invite us to change. It may correct us. It definitely is going to stretch us, but it does not erase our divine identity. He does not need to destroy who we are in order to help us become who we are meant to be. Look, I'm still learning to recognize the voice that says, "You're not legitimate" at times. I'm still putting that puzzle together. And I'm still noticing how the tactics show up in my thoughts, in my family, in my goals, in my insecurities. But I think awareness gives us a choice. Once we recognize the label, we can stop treating it like truth. We can hold it up to the light and ask where it came from. We can ask what it is producing in us. And we can ask what God calls us first. Before every label, I pick up along the way. God's voice begins with the relationship. You are my son or my daughter. And maybe that's where healing starts. Let's not pretend the other labels don't exist. Not by denying our roles. Don't deny them. Don't deny your role or your struggle, your mistakes or your unfinished growth. But refuse to let anything smaller than God's voice have the final word over who we are. So this week, when that old label starts to show up, when that voice starts to say you're not enough, or you're too far behind, you don't count, you should do more or be more by now, or you're not legitimate, pause yourself long enough to ask, who told me that? And what did God call me first? Thanks for listening. This is Justin, and this is episode 5, Labels. If this episode made you think of someone who has been carrying a label they were never meant to carry, maybe share it with them. Not because this conversation fixes everything, but because sometimes people need to be reminded that the labels that we have worn for years may not be the name that God calls them by. As always, keep moving forward, keep your eyes on Christ, and until next time, this is Justin, and you've been listening to From Hollow to Holy.